Welcome to Breach Happens Podcast and Webisode, brought to you by Armada Insurance, the leading specialist for standalone cyber insurance. Today, we're proud to debut the first in our Breach Happens podcast webisode series entitled, Can Your Business Financially Survive a Cyber Attack? We welcome Armada Insurance's team of specialists, along with our panel of special guests.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our very first webisode of Breach Happens, sponsored and hosted by Armada Insurance. Today, we are so fortunate to have a really diverse and talented panel join us. And as you can see, we're doing it via Zoom because we're all working remote and from home. Before we get started, though, we'll introduce all our panelists and be able to get an idea of who will be joining us today and hopefully in future webisodes. But first, I wanted to just share with you the purpose of this series and what we'll be primarily talking about today. We'll be talking about how we're able to help businesses understand why they need standalone cyber insurance coverage. And this would be versus what is often seen as a more traditional checkbox, if you will, in an errors and omissions scenario, oftentimes referred to as silent cyber. I'm using some terminology that's very common in our industry, but we're going to take it down to a more simplified and understandable experience. So without further ado, I want to begin to introduce the panelists. I myself am Christina Tierney. I'm the Senior Vice President of Marketing and Sales for Armada Insurance. I'll be one of the moderators today. And moving on to our Brady Bunch group here, I'm going to move down to the bottom and introduce you to Ed Bremen, who is our founder and principal of the organization. And Ed, if you'll be so kind, I'd love for you to be able to share a little bit about your background and who you are with the organization.
Absolutely, Christina, and thank you everyone for being here. The essence is that after spending many years, much more than I'd like to admit, at the C-level of companies, I came across cyber insurance and cyber risk about 5 years ago and realized that the financial threat companies were facing, they didn't know about and were entirely unprepared for. And that is the essence of why we started Cyber Armada, was to be able to enable companies to understand and better manage that risk and hopefully be able to survive the financial consequences of a cyber attack. And so we've gotten this group together today to discuss just that and hopefully, like Christina had said, get to a point where we can talk about things that are not so much technical in nature, but really about the business risks that companies are facing these days. And with that, I will pass it on to Dawn Christie.
Hi, I'm Dawn Christie, Vice President of Cyber Solutions. I'm a trained lawyer with over 25 years experience working on emerging risk, both in the US and 12 years abroad. And I've also been a cyber subject matter expert at a large broker based in Chicago. And here at Cyber Armada, I am responsible for thought leadership and education when it comes to cyber and privacy issues. Outside of work, I'm involved with youth in STEM, learning about STEM, and also STEM careers.
My name is Brian Hester. I'm the VP of Cyber Risk here at Cyber Armada. My background is mostly in insurance, and where I've spent about 14 years on the carrier side before joining the broker side here at Cyber Armada, with the last 7 years on the carrier side, underwriting specialty professional liability and mostly cyber risk and cyber exposures. So I'm very excited to be here and discuss all of the cyber risks and cyber insurance market.
My name is Andrew Lipton. I'm an attorney at the White & Williams law firm based in New York. I'm an insurance coverage lawyer. I've represented management and professional liability insurers on complex coverage matters for multiple years, and more recently developed an expertise in representing cyber insurers, and in that capacity have come to work with cyber insurers and their insureds on various coverage issues involving their policies and where coverage is, and more importantly where it isn't.
My name is Rich Gatz. I'm Claims Counsel at Coalition. Lawyer by trade, but I've spent the last 12 years working in professional liability and financial alliance claims. Last 7 or 8 have been focused primarily on cyber and technology insurance. Like to think of myself as a technophile. I know enough to know what I don't know, which I think is the first step to really being able to help insureds and get the proper vendors and stuff in place. Because I think, one of the primary concerns with cyber is not a lot of people know what it is. Like, yeah, you can change Windows or install Windows, but you might not know how to review logs of your Microsoft 365 account or other things like that. So I come from, a pure insurance background. I do have some privacy certifications and have advised our insureds on privacy compliance issues. But at the same time, my primary function is, helping an insured on their worst day, hopefully solve some cyber risk, and, leveraging our broker business partners like Cyber Armada, as well as our panel vendors to help them solve that.
My name is Debbie Reynolds. I'm the founder, CEO, and Chief Data Privacy Officer at Debbie Reynolds Consulting. My work is centered around data privacy and cyber globally. I mostly work with companies that have some level of multinational interests, whether they have companies overseas or interests overseas, or even just trying to unravel everything that's happening now in the U.S. with privacy. So I've been in the privacy and data space for over 25 years. So I'm a data junkie, or a nerd, as most people call it. But I've worked a lot with multinational companies in terms of data flows and data transfer. So I am happy to be on the panel today to talk to you guys about data privacy and how that ties in with cyber risk.
Well, thank you all, and thank you all for being here. So I think before we dive into some details, we've kicked around a number of insurance terms already. So why don't we do a little bit of a level set and look at the basics of the insurance and get a little more into cyber risk. So Dawn, if you wouldn't mind starting off here, could you briefly explain the differences between standalone cyber and what is commonly called silent cyber coverage?
Sure. Actually, the entire webisode could cover just this topic because it's pretty extensive. But standalone cyber is really a separate, self-standing cyber policy, as opposed to a policy that's combining cyber with other things in a package or adding on a bolt-on endorsement. So the term standalone basically just means separate, on its own, tailored for cyber coverage. And we're going to get into the nuts and bolts of that throughout. With silent cyber, it's really, in my mind, and this is also a debated definition, but in my mind, it's this idea of the interpretation of an insurance policy by a court. And, to the average policyholder, well, what does that mean? Well, silent cyber came about as a term that means unintended cyber coverage, a wording that was written for commercial insurance purposes, and there's a varied amount of those, which we'll get into today. But the idea is that it was not written to cover cyber. And there's really 3 things. There's no inclusion of cyber, there's no exclusion of cyber, and there's no clarity of cyber. So from a policyholder standpoint, if you think that that's what you can rely on if you have a cyber incident, it's really kind of a roll of the dice, because you do not know if a court is going to define that policy as granting cyber coverage. And so that's where the term silent comes. If it's silent in exclusion, if it's silent in inclusion, and yet a court finds cyber coverage, that's granting silent cyber, which the insurance company may not have intended. And so that's my perspective on it, if others want to add their opinion.
I'll jump in real quick. So really simply put, when somebody experiences a breach or a security event, they don't want to be not in the know whether or not they have coverage. They need help right now. They need solutions to fix the problem at that moment. And so silent cyber is really not a viable long-term solution for clients and businesses. And being in the unknown realm of silent cyber is not a good place to be. That's solved by a standalone cyber policy.
Well, and I think one of the things, and is terminology. Anything around technology in general is very confusing. And the term silent cyber seems to have a lot of different connotations. Wouldn't you say, Andrew? I know you've mentioned this in the past.
Right. So I think the best way, at least from my perspective, to talk about this is to think of it as sort of an example ground up. So let's say you're a law firm, your company's a law firm or an accounting firm, or maybe it's a doctor's office, and you think about what your sort of general insurance needs are. And let's say that that's a professional liability policy, right? That's situations where you would like coverage in the event that one of your patients or your customers sues you over your professional services. So that's a typical malpractice suit or something like that. Well, let's say you're, that law firm or that doctor's office, but you experience a data breach, or you experience something similar to that involving your office's computer systems, or something involving the data that you have on your computer systems. And let's say one of your customers sues you over your mishandling of that data. Well, if you're a doctor's office or a law firm, and you get a lawsuit like that, and all you have is a professional liability policy, there will be a question as to whether or not that lawsuit really is covered under a professional liability policy. Because at the end of the day, from the insurer's perspective, just again, based on my experience, we will have to sort of take a look at whether or not that lawsuit arises out of your professional services or not. And so have there been situations where a lawsuit involving a data breach levied against a law firm or a doctor's office is covered by a traditional professional services policy? Probably, but that's not a risk you want to take. What you would want in that situation, just like Brian said, is you would want a standalone product that explicitly covers a lawsuit arising out of a data breach. And there are products, i.e. cyber insurance, typically in this market, that'll cover that. So that's how I view silent cyber. And frankly, as those have said already, just not really something to rely upon. And at the end of the day, as Dawn said, a judge in a court anywhere can do, frankly, whatever they want with the interpretation of an insurance policy.
Yeah.
So that's typically how I view it.
Question.
Well, and the data aspects coming in there just really make me want to see what Debbie has on this.
It's very challenging because I feel like companies, if the trains are running on time, they're really not seeing sometimes the value of cyber insurance. They're like, I've been doing this forever. We have this down pat. We have the most secure, network ever. So part of it is just a fantasy of some people's idea that they could never possibly be breached ever, and that's just not the case. It's not a if, it's sort of a when, and how much damage can be done to your business. So a lot of it is just coming to terms with the reality of things that, the breaches that you see in the news, those can happen to anyone. So being able to understand, where your risks are, what is your attack surface like, what are your, data privacy concerns? Because as we know, a lot of people get into data privacy issues or fines because of data breach a lot of times. So you can fly under the radar a lot of times, except for when you have a data breach, and then all hell breaks loose. So
I have a quick question for the panel based on this, if I may. Real quick, so this is fascinating. Wondering if anyone has any thoughts on the size of an organization. Does this, have different impacts on different, depending on the size of your organization? I think one of the misperceptions is that this is only an issue for, Fortune 500 and above, and major organizations. I was wondering if anyone on the panel would like to speak to whether or not this is a challenge amongst all levels of.
Let me jump in just because I just read something recently about this. So I don't know, you guys have probably seen this because you're insurance folks. So there was a statistic recently, I can't remember, it was a Cisco study, but anyway, the statistic was that a lot of small to medium-sized companies, they tend to have a ton more data privacy or cybersecurity risks. And some of those companies end up going out of business within like 6 to 12 months after a breach. So it's a serious problem. And I feel like if you have two people, you need cyber insurance. If you have one person, you need cyber insurance. Like if you deal with data electronically anywhere in a business, you need to have insurance specifically for that.
That's fantastic. Thank you.
I would add to that too, that it's not so much the size, but it's two things. One is the vulnerability of the entity, and also the value of the data you hold. There was an incident in Michigan that was really heartbreaking, where this 2-doctor office had a ransomware attack. $6,500 ransom payment sought, which is not seen as very large vis-a-vis other ransom demands. But they were 65 and near retirement, and what they decided to do was fold. They felt, they decided, we're not going to try to restore data, we're not paying the ransom, we're going to retire. They wrote to all their clients, and of course they incurred HIPAA fines. But they simply did not have the wherewithal at 65 to carry on and deal with all of this, which is really that's a very small example, but it just shows you that some people just don't have the wherewithal to take this on.
And what's Coalition seeing as far as the different sizes of companies that you deal with, Rich?
Yeah, so we are primarily in the small, middle business market, but we do have some mid-market and hopefully extending into, larger cap companies in the future. But I mean, it's really all over the board, especially with a black swan event like COVID that's occurred, where you have companies that never developed the network infrastructure to work remotely, and they might not have the IT resources to deploy something like that with the proper safeguards. So everyone's getting hit. I mean, it's crimes of opportunity more often than not. You can do essentially what's a Google search to see if there's an open RDP port, and then get unauthorized access to an entire network and deploy malware. There's hundreds, if not thousands, of breaches with a lot of employees that like to use their, employee email and the password for their employee email to sign up for LinkedIn or Fitbit or whatever it is. So we're really seeing it across the board. I mean, but something to caveat what, others have been saying is, cyber insurance isn't just necessarily in regards to data as well. Like our policies and a lot of policies in the market also have a funds transfer fraud component. They also have a, in regards to network extortion and cyber, ransomware, where the type of data might be backed up, but the insured doesn't want to have that data disclosed publicly, right? Or maybe they're not actually maintaining any personally identifiable information or private health information. But at the same time, there's third-party corporate information. So they're going to face a lawsuit because they have a contractual agreement with a third party to not disclose, material terms of a contract. So, I think initially when I first started cyber insurance, I was always talk to an insured and say, hey, this isn't cyber insurance, it's privacy insurance, right? Like you're supposed to protect your private information, but it's morphed. It's more than that now. And it's to safeguard your company in case you have, the coalition policy, security failure, data breach, privacy liability, funds transfer fraud. I've had a couple of claims come in where we have people that are taking advantage of credit card payment portals on a website to test fraud, stolen credit cards. Yeah. And so an insured called me up the other day, and they had someone run 250,000 credit cards in a 12-hour period. Okay. And they get charged. They get charged for that, right? And so luckily they had, made a good decision insurance-wise. Maybe their broker did, I don't know. so where they have coverage for that under the coalition policy. So yeah, I mean, it's everywhere. I mean, it's almost like a shotgun scatter shot approach, right? Like you shoot it, pellets go out, people get hit by, some type of extortion, business email compromise, or social, just kind of the extension of the cyber insurance market generally, where you're starting to see some of these crime coverage, almost like a social engineering coverage or, computer fraud coverage that you would typically only see on a crime policy, but now you're starting to see on cyber policies as well.
I think also what's interesting about that, in my mind, it's not necessarily the size of the organization, it's more the size of the cost, right? When you're an organization, whether it's a small doctor's office or it's a mid-market company, you need to retain the same vendors to conduct a forensic investigation if you've been breached, or to help you get your systems back online. And I'm sure Rich knows better than I do, but they don't charge anything different necessarily if you're a smaller organization than not. So at the end of the day, insurance is all about who's going to pay your bills, right? Your costs and who's going to pay your bills. And so size of the risk and size of the cost versus size of the organization is my thought on that.
Right. And a natural outgrowth to, I think, the question of who needs cyber insurance is also who understands the cyber insurance that they have. Right. And so that's something too, where I see large companies and small companies that are like, oh yeah, we got hit by ransomware like 6 months ago. Should we turn that into you? It's like, well, you should. The policy, usually contains a provision where we have to consent to any services that are incurred and whatnot. So I think that brokers across the board are doing a good job, importing the importance of privacy insurance and cyber insurance. But I do think that, at least in my experience, of course, I'm only dealing with insured entities, right? So there's a little bit of survivor bias here. But also, saying, hey, not only do you need cyber insurance, but this is what your cyber insurance does.
Right.
Well, and it seems that we're hitting on something that is really important, that it's about who's going to pay your bills, as Andrew said. It's about surviving financially, but there also seems to be a lot of confusion because we call it cyber insurance. And who I'd be curious, Rich, Debbie, Andrew, anyone who has a perspective on this or has seen this, but there's a confusion around, well, it's cyber something, so it's got to be security, so I'll kick it to the IT department. Rich, you're already nodding.
Yeah. So I've actually gotten a lot of claims in that there is no coverage because so our policy, and I've worked at several different carriers, and typically there needs to be either a reasonable suspicion or proof of a data breach, security failure, or something along those lines. When I worked at CNA, the trigger seemed to, on some policies, was was there any potential violation of the security breach notice law, right? Or what you need to do to comply with the security breach notice law, right? So a lot of people like, oh hey, so let me get a good example out of all the ones in my head right now. But my computer stopped working. Is that a covered claim? Okay, well, did you have unauthorized access to an email account? Was there unauthorized access to your database or server or any other systems? Was there unauthorized access to your managed service provider? And like, no, it just kind of stopped working. Okay, well, that's not what cyber insurance is. And like, oh, well, we pay for this for cyber insurance, and it has to do with computers. No, it doesn't. Like, there needs to be like a little bit more.
There needs to be some kind of, an actual threat or an attack or something going on there. And it also brings up the fact that I think one of the reasons insureds get so confused, and any non-insureds, is that the threats and the sort of tools for crime that cyber criminals are using are continually evolving. And Debbie, you're nodding. You've seen a little bit of this. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Oh my goodness, yeah. Especially, I think the threats are increasing because so many people are working from home now. So, that stretches out the attack surface, and also cyber criminals like when people are sort of nervous and they're sort of a chaotic situation. So this pandemic is really creating that for them. So it's really maybe not that unusual that you would get an email from someone out of the blue that you typically wouldn't hear from or something. So cyber criminals are really taking advantage of that. And a lot of that takes, especially with like business email compromise, those things, is typically some inbound message that you would get that would as asking you to take action, and they want you to do it like right away. So, that's typically what happens. And I always tell people, sort of switch it up. So if someone sends you an email, tell them to call you or say, can I call you? And a lot of times that stops them in their tracks because they really want to keep you on the same line, whether there's email or a phone call. They want to keep you in that same mode, whether it's texting or whatever. So, definitely don't get off your game, just because we're having, this huge pandemic and people are, frazzled, trying to find new ways to work in life. But that, I'm sure you guys are seeing a lot more claims from people, getting into these entanglements, quote unquote, that they would not have probably fell for when they were in office.
No, I think that's a great point. And I always tell everyone, I'm like, you act like it's like 1985 up in here. Okay. Like reach out and touch someone via the telephone. So many claims have come in where it's like, oh, well, hey, I don't want to go to the bank to deposit this check. So can you just direct deposit? And so many people, because that's a perfectly reasonable thing to hear, right? Like, I don't want to go to the bank. And so they're like, oh, okay, all right, yeah, we'll just change this up, and it's like, all right, well, did you call them just to verify? It's like, oh, no, I deal with them all the time. Okay, well, this was $400,000. This is not, it's not like a grand or two, even though that's a lot of money too. Has anyone here ever read Dune, the Dune series? Right? This is going to be a little geeky, but it's a webisode, so it's going to work, right? So in the Dune series, it's like this super technologically advanced society. So what they did is they basically developed these shields where you couldn't be shot because anything of a faster speed would be completely blocked, right? So what did they do for like space combat? They went back to like swords and like axes and stuff like that. And that's kind of what we need to do to fight cybercrime is you got to stop with the high speed stuff. Heck, send someone snail mail. You know what I mean? They'll be safer.
Yeah. I think TV and movies don't help because they always, it's always some super elaborate thing like Tom Cruise hanging from the ceiling and stuff like that. And it's really like your grandma who posted her password on her monitor. That's literally what's happening. So,
how about employee errors, right? If an employee error causes some kind of downtime in your network or something else that happens, I think for all the best and the worst reasons, when we talk about cyber risk, we're always thinking about the nefarious hacker with the JPEG that we've all seen on every single article that comes out with the darkened face and the hoodie, huddled over the laptop. But the claims that I've seen, at least from the outside coverage angle, a lot of them are employee error based. You have a systems engineer that deploys a package of code in a production environment versus a testing environment. It wipes all the data out. You have costs that your company's incurred, and then your customers are suing you too. To me, that's a prototypical example. And again, I'm sure Rich can say yes or no to this, but that's a prototypical example of a claim submitted under a cyber insurance policy nowadays, which, and again, this may be getting into more technical, but both has a first party and third party component to it. And that's what makes it separate and apart from, as I said earlier, a typical professional malpractice policy or a typical management liability policy, directors and officers insurance, that type of stuff. The policies are complex, but they're designed to address complex risks, dynamic risks, dynamic sets of coverage. And so I think, in this conversation, I think it's also important to have self-checks on what we're talking about and how it's covered potentially. Right? I'm curious from Rich's perspective too. So a business email compromise where that $400,000 payment did go through, and now company is searching for, what do I do next? I mean, under a typical form, what kind of coverage is out there for that?
So like typically, it really depends on what you purchase, right? And so like at Coalition, I mean, of course, now and going forward, I'm always going to be like Coalition, right? Like we're going to talk about what our policy does and how we handle that. And I think I would like to think we have a market leading claims team, but that's because I am part of the claims team. But the thing is that it's generally similar to other places in that, did you purchase funds transfer fraud? Our funds transfer fraud is specific to your funds that are stolen. So if you get a fraudulent instruction transmitted to you and then you rely upon that and you send out the money, then typically it's covered. Some policies have a dual authorization component where we would ask you to verify. I've had a claim where someone, the individual, everyone loves claim stories, right? But tip number one, don't put bookkeeper information on the World Wide Web, right? Like don't say, this is our bookkeeper, okay? And just put that out to the public, because that's never good. Because someone did that and the bookkeeper got an email from office president 2016@gmail.com, but it had their actual office president's name on it. Asked for a wire transfer request. Gmail apparently caught that email address as spam. They changed it to officepresident2017@gmail.com. But the bookkeeper said, okay, cool. Walked down the office, knocked on the guy's door, or CEO's door, and said, hey, I got this wire transfer. Can we process it? He said, yeah, go ahead. Okay. And so, okay. He wakes up cold sweat like 3 weeks later. He's like, wait, what? And then they turned it into us. But going back to your original question, typically if it's the insured's account, it's covered. We also offer an endorsement called invoice manipulation, because a lot of times what we'll see is there will be a business email compromise on one side or the other, and the wire instructions will be changed, or the banking instructions will be changed. And sometimes our insured will have been provided services to a client or third party for which they're expecting payment, but that payment is redirected. Now, a typical funds transfer fraud policy is not going to cover that, because it usually requires, it's a first party coverage, right? So it's where you've been damaged with your funds. And invoice manipulation, it's kind of a first party coverage because you've been damaged, but it's not typically going to fall into a funds transfer fraud coverage part. So, that's something that, we've seen a lot of success with, and I actually really like it when our insureds have that on their policies, just because, what's the monetary value of 50 hours of work? Or if you are a nonprofit, right? Because we write a lot of nonprofits, and you're expecting to get paid $50,000 for some work, and you don't, So we are seeing a lot of funds transfer fraud claims. They're probably the most that we see, and I really love to cover them, because my worst day is not being able to cover a claim.
When we're talking to potential customers, clients, as a specialty brokerage, Cyber Armada Insurance, all we do is standalone cyber insurance. One of the challenges that we run into is the ambiguous policies that they have, and helping these organizations understand you have an ambiguous policy. All of the stuff that we've been talking about right here goes into some pretty intense specifics. The traditional, commercial property general liability doesn't have this area of specialty. So, what I'm interested to hear about, and I know we've been talking about a little bit, but being unambiguous, the importance of staying away from ambiguity. I was making a new word, ambiguity with respect to cyber insurance, and that we're not able to really help, it seems, and I chalk this up a little bit to the challenging times that we're in, but we do see that oftentimes when we're talking to customers, they just, no, we're covered. And I feel like we just can't stress enough, I don't think you quite understand what you don't understand. I'm curious the thoughts from the panel on that.
I'm happy to chime in here. This is a great segue back into silent cyber, what Rich and Debbie and Andrew have spoken about, which is this whole idea, and it's interesting to hear the coalition coverage is that broad. The historic case law on silent cyber has very much focused on commercial crime policies. And it's really like finger in the air. Is it covered or not covered? So I think there was a case in the Fifth Circuit that found there was no coverage for the policyholder under crime, but then 2 other circuits found that there was cyber coverage under a crime policy. And Rich touched on a very important point, and that is trickery is not unauthorized access. Crime policies and computer fraud under crime policies are not the same as cyber. And so the idea would be somebody comes into the computer system and takes funds, not that you in your office are tricked by an email and you as an authorized person then wire the money. And so again, relying on the commercial crime coverage that you have to say, well, that's an email, so it's cyber and I'm covered under crime. That's really a misconception. And I know Brian has worked extensively on the invoice manipulation versus business email compromise, if he wants to add more to that, because it's really an interesting topic.
Yeah, exactly. So I think one of the things, like Christina was talking about, is when people think that they're covered, today, typical funds transfer fraud doesn't give you all the coverage that you need. Invoice manipulation is a key component, and it's the most popular thing that we hear about. I shouldn't say popular, but it's the most common thing that we hear about when we're speaking with our clients. It's a necessity as part of your cyber insurance. And so, and to even piggyback on top of that, there's so many different coverage components that have really evolved over the last couple of years that are necessary to really recover from cyber attack and have your business up and running. Little things like the reputational loss and harm, and that's not talked about very often, but your company, if you have a breach and you have to notify individuals in the public and put out a press release, there's a negative impact that comes with that, and you could very well have a dip in sales. And some good cyber policies will provide coverage to either help repair your damaged reputation or even recover some of the lost profits due to a hit in your reputation. So it's things like that that don't really come to mind when people think that they have the right coverage, because there's the right coverage and then there's the actual right coverage.
Right. And I would just add one more thing about cyber policies. And one thing that I've seen, some policies have, like you said, coverage for what happens after the breach. So after you've decided, or after you plug the hole, so to speak, and got your network, in order, there is a public relations piece. There is a reputational piece. There is a notification piece, and that's not always covered in the way that people think that it should be covered in policy. So people really, like you said, really need to understand the trajectory of what happens in a breach and the things they could possibly need and how their coverage really would meet those scenarios.
I mean, and here's something too, though, that just anyone that has insurance needs to understand. There can be circumstances and facts that occur in a way that you just can never fully forecast, right? So an insurance policy is a contract, and both sides are beholden to the provisions of that insurance policy. So when we say, yeah, we have a broad funds transfer fraud coverage, yeah, that's true. Is it always covered? No, but I mean, that's every insurance policy. Because again, the world is weird and you never know exactly 100% what's going to happen. But what you can do is you can look at, what happens if my email account is accessed? What happens if my data is stolen? What happens if my data is stolen by an employee? What happens if I get hit with ransomware? What happens if I get a phishing email and then I infect one of my clients? You know what I mean? Like, you can go through like the primary risk scenarios and say, hey, is this covered? Is this not covered? But again, I think an overarching theme is, again, you never know 100% if it's covered. And we can talk and this is the lawyer coming out, right? So, we can talk hypotheticals, but nothing's ever guaranteed, right? Because there could be something that, there could be exclusionary language. I would say the primary thing that we see is we see late notice, and so that's something that a lot of people, they're so concerned about their security and privacy compliance and stuff like that. They don't notify their brokers, or sometimes the brokers don't notify the carriers. Like, oh, I get this a lot. Hey, can you just take this as notice of a record of a matter? It's like, yo, bro, you guys got hit by ransomware. Okay, that's a claim. Like, that's not like notice, right? Like, can you take this as a potential claim? No, that's a claim. So I'm from Chicago, if you guys haven't noticed the accent or me talking very fast. But I like to say, report early, report often, kind of like vote early, vote often, right? So if you even think that there's any type of issue, just report it to your carrier. Even if you're not going with Coalition or whatnot, like, just report it, just have them look at it, have them tell you whether it's a claim or not. Because, again, the world's weird, but if you do have coverage, you should get coverage for it. And there's nothing worse than saying, hey, if you had notified us of this would have been 100% covered. Because you didn't, we can only cover expenses going forward.
Hey, Dawn.
One of my least favorite things to do as well.
Hold on a second, Andrew. Dawn has had her hand up for a minute or two. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Dawn. I'm sorry.
Well, again, it kind of brings up this idea of silent cyber. And just a quick story. I played virtual trivia on Thursday nights, and I had to explain what cyber insurance was to somebody that never heard of it, which makes you realize how you have to go down to sort of basics and try to explain it. And then the other side of it, based on what Rich was just saying, is Lloyd's, which has been hit with losses in other lines of business, has tried to become proactive. And this would not be for the every person. This is more high level. However, it's interesting to note that they came up with specific cyber exclusions to address silent cyber or unintended cyber. And they've done it in buckets, which is first property, and then it was going to be liability and treaty reinsurance. Now I've read that liability and treaty reinsurance have been postponed somewhat. But the idea is they want it to be explicit, and it's all these things we've talked about. Don't guess that my other insurance will cover it. Don't guess that my package or portfolio will cover it. In fact, it needs to be spelled out. Is it included? Is it excluded? Don't be ambiguous. If it's excluded, get a self-standing, standalone cyber policy. And I think I admire Lloyd's for actually doing that.
Andrew?
No, I was just going to add off of Rich's point that, it's almost two different conversations. First, it's what does cyber insurance cover typically, and then how do you use it? How do you use it correctly? How do you build it into your risk management program as a company and use it as a proper tool? I mean, as outside coverage counsel, it's one of my, I'll go on the record and say one of my least favorite things when there's been what I'd call, or what we call, a foot fault, right? There would otherwise be coverage for something, but the insured breached the notice provision. And you're in a jurisdiction where, not to get too legalese, but you're in a jurisdiction where the insurer doesn't need to demonstrate prejudice by that late notice. It's just late notice and that's it, no coverage. Those are difficult conversations to have, especially when you look at the form and you realize that otherwise there would have been sort of explicit coverage for this type of cost, and that has to be a very difficult thing from the company perspective, the insured perspective, where, again, you've got a basket full of bills that otherwise would have been paid, and you wouldn't have had to book it on your books as a cost to the company, but for something like that type of footfall.
It's interesting to me, if I may, we're talking about a lot of interesting incidents or threats or kinds of a cyber attack that most people are not really familiar with. I think that anybody that doesn't have any clue that they need standalone cyber insurance would listen to this and begin to feel very overwhelmed. And what does all this mean? I would like to offer it up and ask, Debbie, maybe Brian, what do you see as some of the more common threats today? We've talked a little bit about this. what are you guys seeing as, and of course, Rich, what are we seeing as some of those more common things that we see as common that are probably not all that well understood by the general, business public about what they should be aware of?
The big one is what Rich talked about as well, as the funds transfer fraud. That's a big one, and until you get an attempt that it's a real attempt that makes you sweat afterwards, it's not at the forefront of your mind, and you don't think about it regularly. And part of that is spear phishing. So this is when someone either somehow gets access to your email, or they just literally just do research or recon, probably, on an individual or a company to get as much information about you, your personality characteristics, how you might send an email, anything personal that you might have on your social media, and use that to try to manipulate somebody else into either sending money or getting access to information. So those are the two big ones that come to mind for me, is the spear phishing and the funds transfer frauds that are taking place. Ransomware's out there and more known, but those are the ones that I think about.
Debbie.
Yeah, so I agree with Brian with what he said. Also, people need to understand, again, back to this point about anyone can be breached at any time. A lot of these, a couple of things that some of the cyber criminals do are, if they breach your network, they may just watch for months and see what the hell's happening. Look at the traffic, look at who talks to whom, and then they may start sending emails from accounts and doing different things. So they have all the time in the world to wait it out to do things like that. Also, back to my Tom Cruise Mission Impossible analogy, it's easier for them to piggyback off of someone who already has access than trying to break in. So, maybe the person in the mailroom, the secretaries are always a target because, maybe they have a wacky CEO that calls them at 3 o'clock in the morning to tell them to do funds transfer. And that's not that big of a difference than what they typically do. So being able to sort of watch out for those things are really important. And like we said before, kind of switch up things. So if someone emails you, try to transfer it over to a phone call, try to verify with the person, even though I think Rich had an example where the person said okay and they just sort of let it happen anyway. It definitely, to me, there's nothing new under the sun. So these things, they've just been updated over the years. I don't know if you guys remember, they used to do these frauds where they fax you a message about some vacation that your business had or something, and you send them their money, and you thought it was like from the accounting department, or it was just a mess. So these are some of the same things. Plus, I think at one point we're going to talk about cloud risk. So yes. I'll wait till that, but I have a comment about that as well.
Well, I would like to say that what's interesting, this is really cool, because what's interesting to me is when we talk to customers, what we find out is that they're very confident that they have all the cybersecurity in place that will take care of them. And maybe my perception is wrong, but what we've just described, you can have the best cybersecurity in the world. And this manipulation of the human nature to help and to respond quickly or we're under stress has nothing to do with cybersecurity. It has to do with us, and you brought it up, Debbie, human error. And what we find is there is this huge mistaken belief that if we move to the cloud, all of this is taken care of and I don't have to think about it and I'm safe. So maybe this, if you could share real quick.
Well, my analogy always is, like Fort Knox is supposed to be super secure, but if they leave all the doors and windows unlocked, this is really not very secure. So being in the cloud is only going to help you to only a certain amount, extent. So you still, when you're provisioning data in the cloud, they're pretty much giving you the keys to the kingdom to manage your own environment. So if you don't have the right people in place to know where those holes are, I've seen a lot of people especially IT folks, a lot of times they like to test things without permissions. So they want to figure out if it works first before they lock things down. And a lot of times they forget to do that. So it's like they have all these holes in the system. It works so that keeps the CEO happy, because that's really all they cared about is it working? But the question they need to ask is it safe? Is it secure? That's really important as well.
I wanted to ask real quick, Debbie, along this vein. We talk a lot about residual cyber risk. We talk to customers and we say, look, great cloud, maybe you have a superb, outsourced or on-site, cybersecurity team taking care of this. But at the end of the day, maybe somebody's left the doors unlocked. You have some residual cyber risk, being that you are the data diva. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that.
I always recommend that people, even if you have a cool team inside, get a third party that can do like a pen test. Have somebody kick the tires from the outside and just see, what they find. You never, it's not as though it's necessarily nefarious about the mistakes that are made, but you definitely want to catch them before they become a huge problem. So, kick the tires periodically, do pen tests, have people do some sniffing around your network to see where the holes are, where the gaps are, especially if you're making changes or doing updates. A lot of times those are opportunities for cyber people to jump in, because a lot of times you have your guard down or you're doing something out of the ordinary that you wouldn't typically be doing.
Cool. Hey, Brian, what are your thoughts on the cloud, man?
I think the cloud is really, generally put, it's not. People think that they're just safe because it's in the cloud. It's fine. It's not my problem. No, it's your problem. If you get, I like to use the analogy that if you have a storage locker and it's broken into and all your stuff's stolen, just because it's in a storage locker doesn't mean it's not your problem. It's there. It's just a different way of getting there. And it's just as simple as stealing credentials. So it's just, if you get their credentials, it's no different them accessing your information in the cloud, whether it's there or in your internal servers. And I mean, I don't know if Rich agrees with that, but that's my general thought about the cloud, is that if someone can get your credentials and get in there, there's no difference than that data being in-house in your servers or just in the cloud.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I mean, I think that ideally you're working with a managed service provider that has additional security that they can recognize, okay, like we got a web login from an IP address that's never logged in before. We're going to, stop this access or have data segregated or compartmentalized or air gapped in a way that, you're not going to get access to everything. But we don't really see that, right? Like, typically what we see is if someone can get into a cloud service provider's access, they can usually level up their credentials and get access to everything. I think that, there's a big difference between AWS and Google Cloud versus, other managed service providers. And something else too is you are increasing, the risk in that, if you have, iron tight cybersecurity practices, but your cloud service provider doesn't, they get hit with ransomware. At a former life, I had a cloud service provider that was essentially storage, and they got hit with ransomware, and I think 600 plus servers got encrypted. Okay, and they were able to restore, I think, like 594, 93 from backups. But those 7 servers had like 15, 20 clients on them that literally couldn't function. They couldn't do business for like 8 months. And if you're paperless, like most companies are now, imagine if you're a law firm and where you store all of your pleadings and documents and work product is inaccessible. And then imagine if the managed service provider doesn't have good cyber insurance and they can't pay the ransom, right? Like, what do you do? So, I mean, I do think that the cloud's good, but again, it goes back to that whole, 1985 joke in that, we're getting really lazy. And so part of that laziness is having, all these, software as a service, application platforms as a service. And so it's like, all right, I don't have to do any of this stuff. All right, yeah, you don't. But at the same time, what do you do if you do lose access to that versus having all of your stuff backed up, via hard drive or something like that. But then again, you run into this situation where I had one claim where a person backed up their stuff every day, took it home, left their car unlocked, and the backup got stolen, and it wasn't encrypted. So I mean, I guess that to shorten this like long-winded reply, I think that there's risk everywhere, right?
Yeah.
And just doing cloud doesn't defray your risk. Doing everything yourself doesn't defray your risk. I mean, so you need cyber insurance, right? You need good cyber insurance because no matter how good you are, something could happen, and that's what insurance is, right? Defraying that risk in the future.
I think one point you hit on there. Sorry to interrupt you there. Is that if say on the cloud provider, so your third-party vendor or whatnot, if they don't have adequate insurance, they could blow through their limit in no time at all, paying that claim out. And so having your own policy will further protect you from even a third-party claim where your data is involved with that.
Right, and most cyber policies, most good cyber policies, will have coverage for third-party service providers where your information is hosted.
At least from my perspective, when I think of cloud, I think of cloud service contracts. An overly lawyerly thing to think about. But as a company, maybe a perceived notion of what your limits of liability are vis-a-vis something that could happen with that cloud service provider or the data that's being serviced by that cloud service provider. But at the end of the day, insurance will cover what the insured is legally obligated to pay as a result of a loss, right? So from an outside counsel's perspective, what we're always looking into when this situation arises is we want to see the contracts and we want to see where the liabilities actually flow. We may disagree with an insured in a given circumstance that the insured was actually legally obligated to pay a certain amount versus the cloud service provider, the MSP. And so I think to accurately measure that as a company looking to buy cyber insurance and looking to assess their risk, you have to map it out. And mapping out risk means, unfortunately, needling through these contracts and figuring out, who actually retains that liability in the event of an incident or anything that we've been talking about. It's all about the fine print, unfortunately.
Right. Yeah. And something really to caveat on that is one, most of the contracts have a limitation of liability, which is usually limited to the amount of the fee, right? So let's say you lose access to your business for 60 days, but you paid it $1,500 a month for the contract for the MSP. That's, in a lot of jurisdictions, that limitation of liability is going to be enforced. And then the other side of it too is, I kind of lost my train of thought, darn it. Maybe it'll come back to me.
I can chime in.
Yeah, there you go. Maybe I'll think of it later.
Go ahead.
No, I completely forgot. So you go ahead.
Okay. So I wanted to chime into Andrew's point, and that is we have been asked about misconfiguration, which is an error. And Brian and I have discussed this even with some potential clients as well. So what if, you've got the cloud, but what if there's a misconfiguration between point A and B? How is that addressed in cyber insurance, if at all? Rich?
So let me just get the hypothetical correct. So, and I'll apologize for the non-lawyers because it can be a little annoying. But so if I understand correctly, the insured is trying to configure, we'll say they're a cloud hosting provider, right? So all of the insured's information is being stored on AWS, and they go in to configure it, and they configure it to have 15 days of backups versus the 60 days of backups that are recommended. They get hit by ransomware. They don't have good backups. Is it something like that? Or is it?
Yes.
Okay. So under our policy, whether or not you have backups isn't material, right? It doesn't matter. I mean, we would hope that you do, but it really doesn't. It's generally, the insurance is generally going to turn on, for first party coverage, have you suffered a security failure or data breach, right? And so, where does that come from? And that includes your third party host providers, if they're hosting your data via contract, right? So misconfiguration, I think I think that would typically be covered. Again, I can't speak in absolutes because I don't have like a full fact pattern in front of me, and you can never really determine coverage unless you have an actual claim in front of you with all the facts out, public to the world. But if it was on the third-party host provider side, I mean, that brings in some interesting questions. I mean, they would have liability, of course, for that. But again, if it did all kind of trickle down from a security failure or data breach, and I think typically that would be covered. If it was just negligence on the part of the third-party host provider, where you lost data, I think that would be a different question. Mm-hmm. Our policy covers theft of data, but that would seem to be more a claim that would arise out of negligence that you would make against your third-party provider, and it wouldn't result from security failure, because our policy isn't going to provide affirmative coverage for you to proactively go after someone. The only caveat to that is our funds transfer fraud coverage, which we would pay expenses to help you try to recover those funds. But other than that, then we're not going to say, hey, you know what, here's some money, go sue someone. You're going to have to be responsible for that on your own.
Debbie, I want to give you a chance to chime in.
I think, I agree exactly with everything that you said. I think that, especially going back to cloud, especially when it comes to sort of backups, people have to understand what is in the contract in terms of how things are backed up. So a lot of times those bare minimum cloud contracts are just for you putting things in the cloud and them keeping them as they are. So let's say you deleted like a ton of stuff. Like they may not be obligated to restore that for you, because your contract may just be for your data as it is, at that moment. So that's like a whole other thing to think about, that people, in addition to, the insurance, but how their cloud is organized and what they're actually paying for, and what can be insured in that situation, depending on what they agreed to.
I think that speaks pretty strongly to the realities that most companies, if not all the companies that we run into, any company out there really needs to be thinking about working with a group that specializes only in cyber, as opposed to trying to see if they can, push everything into a little box to be okay, and to take care of everything in one fell swoop. We're coming up on an hour, and I want to be mindful of everyone's time. So I've got a couple of quick, maybe rapid fire things I want to share that I'd like to ask the entire panel. Right now, we've got folks that are virtual and remote. If everyone could kind of and those that wish to respond, what risks right now, and there have been a lot of different webinars and a lot of different articles that we've seen written by many about what companies are facing with the move to virtual remote work. As a closing down of our little panel discussion, does anybody want to talk about what you feel are the biggest risks with respect to that?
The way I tend to think about it, because we're with so many people virtual, is if you have an office, you've got one, maybe two doors that you have to make sure are locked at night, and you turn on one alarm. When everybody's working remotely, every person has one or two doors. They probably have their cars. The potential to have something unlocked somewhere increases exponentially. And I think that's the biggest challenge that we face. And it's very difficult for security professionals to deal with it in any way, shape, or form, because they don't have control. Again, if you have one office, you make sure that one person is responsible for locking the doors at night. And if that person isn't there, it falls to the second person, but there's always a responsible party. But when you have 5, 10, 50, 500, it becomes a whole different scenario. And I don't think that we've really gotten to a point, and I definitely want to hear from all of the lawyers and experts on the call, but I don't think we've gotten to a point where there's been any kind of litigation or discussion around how different policies are going to respond. And it really points out, I think, the importance of having the best possible cyber policy you can, because there's an emerging threat. Most of the people who actually, and they're in the lower percentage right now, who have cyber coverage, when they bound that policy, we weren't in this situation. So I'm very curious to hear what everyone else has to say.
I can go kind of touch on that a little bit, where recently what carriers have done is, or good carriers that are good on, keep up to date with emerging risks, they'll put a BYOD endorsement or basically an affirmative cover to help protect against that. And not every, a substandard policy wouldn't be doing that, or a bolt-on wouldn't be doing that. Silent cyber, you don't know anything with silent cyber until the court decides a lot of times. So that's what I've seen that really is something that I think clients and businesses would have peace of mind seeing that endorsement for the BYOD, and that's bring your own device.
I was going to say.
I was like, John?
Yep.
I've actually had some interesting discussions with Debbie about this, because we're kind of and she can obviously explain this further, but I think because of the situation we're in during the pandemic, we're at a privacy crossroads, and we may never go back. And we're also at a biometrics crossroads, and we may never go back. And I'll explain why. Privacy, contact tracing, location tracking, massive data collection and sharing during the pandemic and beyond. How careful are we? And then with biometrics, you can never go back with facial recognition, fingerprints, voice. Once that's out there, that's you as a human. You can't take that back. It's a different type of data. So my concern going forward is definitely emerging risk and really under the privacy umbrella.
Debbie?
Yeah, we were talking about this. We were just geeking out about this whole topic. A lot of employers now, or a lot of businesses, are looking into doing things like thermal cameras or temperature checks, or a lot of these cameras sometimes have facial recognition technology or capabilities in it. So you're just sort of expanding the risk of the data that you have. And depending on the state that you're in, like Illinois, like Rich and I are in, we have a very strict biometric law here about how you can store or keep someone's biometric information. So, obviously it's a legal issue, but it's also a data issue and a technology issue, because you're amassing so much more data, and depending on how sensitive it is, you may get into other entanglements that you may not have ever had to think about before. Like let's say you own a restaurant, you may have never had to take anyone's temperature or store it anywhere. So being able to handle those challenges are emerging. But then also, as Brian talked about with BYOD, I think companies, I think it's been a pendulum. So I remember back in the day, companies didn't want people to bring their own device. So they'd always give them a device. Then it went the other way, where they're like, well, let's save money and let people use their own devices. Now that's like a nightmare in and of itself. So now some people are going the other way. Like, let's give people their own devices. But then we're in the middle now, where companies, because so many people now are having to work from home, it may be a business advantage for them not to have to pay to give someone their own device right now. Maybe they'll just sort it out at some point. But I think eventually they'll move towards not doing BYOD because of all the security risks and problems with it. You think, especially working from home now, you're working from home, you have kids doing homework, it's not uncommon that people, share machines or computers with profiles and, a lot of different things commingled on devices. Or let's say you're printing out a contract, or a kid uses it to do their homework on, there are just a lot of different things that you wouldn't typically have in the office that are now a big umbrella of concern, and it will impact insurance, I'm sure.
To pair it off of Brian's point, at least what I'm seeing is a concern in the policies over the definition of computer system. So does your current cyber insurance policy define your computer system as machines in a network that are physically located on at your company's site, and only those machines, right? Or does it explicitly say that it also encompasses devices that you may use that are connected to your network via VPN or otherwise, which is what we're all doing, at least in frankly, unless it's a remote desktop, connection by VPN. So that's something to think about. I think my other thought in terms of emerging risk and just in how, again, to touch on something that Debbie said, I think about the human factor because, quite frankly, the human factor in terms of cyber risk is now, I think, coming more to the forefront and less of a, technology first, human factor second. At the end of the day, it's the human clicking on the phishing email. It's the human, opening the email and reading instructions and actually acting on those instructions. And what I think about is that just collectively as a working populace, we're far more stressed because of the conditions that we're placed in. So it's something to think about, just in terms of, we all have potentially childcare issues and work from home issues and things that we're all constantly distracted by. While we're also trying to do our jobs remotely, I think just increases cyber risk sort of manifold because of the human factor.
I mean, I think that there's just so many different things that can go wrong, right? Like you have so many different avenues of attack. You have so many different places where you're storing information, how you're using information. You have a increasingly complex regulatory environment. With the GDPR, CCPA, all 50 states have data privacy compliance statutes now. It's really just a smorgasbord of risk. And so I think that, how you go about ensuring that risk is a question that we're all working on, I think. And, it's going to be very interesting to see how the insurance market continues to develop. If it's going to harden in, this COVID environment, or if we're going to see a reduction in the type of insurance that carriers are willing to provide, because we're seeing such a large uptick in claims that, especially for the larger carriers, that, I personally wonder if they're going to start saying, hey, you know what, we can't cover that part of the risk anymore. I mean, just generally for the past, 5-6 years, cyber insurance has been like a balloon. It's just been like, how much coverage can we stuff in here over and over and over again? We just want the most coverage ever that we can give you, but it's going to have to pop eventually because the amount of risk that you're insuring under one policy is going to grow so big that it's not going to be feasible.
I have one question for Rich. And if anyone else is able to chime in with this, it'd be great. I'm curious if you have any examples of where having a really robust and solid standalone cyber insurance policy in place really saved an organization, really helped them to, get back on their feet. They didn't have the kind of, catastrophic impact that they could have had. Do you have any examples that, without, necessarily naming?
Oh my gosh. Yeah. I would say like 95% of my ransomware claims, because we're seeing a mass. Sorry?
Is there one that sticks out for you specifically that without naming the company name, but just an incident? That
Sure. Honestly, there's so many. I don't know if there's one that could stick out just because, ransomware is becoming it has been a huge deal for a while, but we're seeing a huge increase in the cost of ransomware events. Okay. So I remember 5 or 6 years ago, like the big thing was like, oh my God, they want a whole Bitcoin. They want $3,500. This is insanity. I mean, I think I've had over the past year, maybe 3 ransomware claims under 6 figures, and even some in 7 figures. So, when you're dealing with small or medium-sized businesses, a lot of these companies aren't liquid, right? Like as we're seeing with COVID, they don't have the ability to just say, hey, bro, here's $50,000, give me my data back, and then these ransomware actors are increasing their asks. They're refusing to negotiate. They're threatening to publish information. They're threatening to shame the insureds, notify all their clients and creditors and even regulatory bodies in regards to, this unauthorized access. So, it's one of those things where, if you're just dealing with a business email compromise, all right, an insurance company or a client can typically deal with that. If it's, a covered entity under HIPAA and they have to notify OCR, right? Well, you know what? Theoretically, they can do that themselves, right? They don't necessarily need to retain counsel, although we'd always recommend that. But if you get hit with a ransomware and they ask you to go to a Tor site to negotiate with these threat actors, and then they're like, hey, bro, we have all your financials and we know how much you make, what your revenue is a year. We want $1.6 million. It's like, all right, well, gross revenue does not mean liquid funds. So, I would say that, again, unfortunately, there's not one that sticks out specifically, but, especially in the environment that we have now, a lot of companies are cash porks who are trying to save their employees and continue to, keep their business functioning. So when a ransomware event comes in, it can be catastrophic.
With that said, I think we have our topic that I'd love us to focus on in the next webisode. I think we could really do a nice deep dive into the intensities and the complexities of ransomware. I personally want to thank all the panelists that joined today. I thought this was a phenomenal conversation. It felt really comfortable, and we got some really good insights into the different facets of, what is, standalone cyber insurance all about. And I want to welcome you to join our next panel. So I hope you'll be on the lookout and thinking about ransomware and what we'll do when we come together again. Thanks, everyone.
Cyber Armada Insurance stands shoulder to shoulder with you before, during, and after the storm of a cyber attack to ensure your business survives. Breach happens.